I'm going to start a little bit differently this morning. Whittaker, of course, I kind of have been mentioning this every Sunday, but Whittaker Locke, our accompanist, has a knack for picking the perfect hymns. And he's done that again. And since we don't sing together and the choir isn't singing together, I've gotten in the habit of having a little introduction for each of the hymns. If you have a gray hymnal handy, this one's going to be 183, The Wind of Change. And there's an interesting story behind this hymn. The words are written by, and I'm going to, does anybody speak Hindi? Are there any Hindi speakers? In that case, this is perfect pronunciation. It is written by Sarojini Naidu, also known colloquially as the Nightingale of India, 1879 to 1949. And this is, in doing this research about this hymn, I discovered once again how Western-centric our history lessons are, because this is a woman who we all should know about in the history of the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. She was an advocate for women's rights, particularly women's voting rights. And this is 19th century India. England still ruled India. She has an amazing history. She's a political activist. She joined the Indian National Congress in 1904. She also was a colleague of Gandhi. She accompanied him on the famous Salt March and to that almost as famous Round Table Conference in 1931. And when Britain got its independence in 1947, the year I was born, which I'm going to add was not that long ago, she was a member of the National Congress, and she also represented what would become the state of Uttar Pradesh. Also a poet. So she wrote the Wind of Change, Forever Blown, and you'll see why this is really relevant to today's service. So Whittaker, if you please, and we won't sing, but you can maybe hum with lips closed and follow along in your hymnals. Whittaker, thank you. Thank you, Whittaker. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Columbus, Georgia. I'm Bill Harlan. I'm your volunteer service leader. We're an inclusive community of people who support each other in our own unique, personal, and responsible searches for truth and meaning. Our speaker today is Nicole Horn, who, just to show you how relevant this speaker is, this is the front page, I think, of today's paper. And if you notice the story on the bottom, companies scraping for staff ahead of holidays. It's a very interesting story by the Associated Press. It's a national story, but it certainly applies in Georgia. And Nicole is going to talk about where have all the workers gone? I kind of made up that title, but where are the workers? And kind of the conventional wisdom, I guess, is that, well, we gave them too much welfare during the pandemic and they don't want to come to work. It turns out there's a lot more to the story than that. So we'll have more to say about Nicole in a few minutes. Before we move on to our speaker, I'd like to do a reading, and it's by that same Sarojini Naidu, a poet. I thought this was one of her poems that was especially appropriate for a beautiful fall day. It's called Autumn Song. Like a joy on the heart of a sorrow, the sunset hangs on a cloud, a golden storm of glittering sheaves, of fair and frail and fluttering leaves. The wild wind blows in a cloud. Hark to a voice that is calling to my heart in the voice of the wind. My heart is weary and sad and alone. For its dreams, like the fluttering leaves, have gone. And why should I stay behind? We're going to welcome Nicole Horn to speak to us today about where are the workers. And she's a person who knows something about workers. She was a waitress at the Waffle House, which is not an easy job. She sold knives door to door. She's leased corporate apartments. She grew small businesses, and this is really important, that helped colleges around the country design programs that would produce graduates that employers would want to hire. She's also running for Georgia Labor Commissioner. But this is not going to be a campaign talk. Nicole is going to talk about the story behind the story that appeared in today's Ledger Enquirer. So please help me welcome Nicole Horn.
Thank y'all so much for having me here today. I will admit that I love getting up and talking about my stump speech and why I'm running, but I also love having a dialogue around some of the big issues we're facing, because I feel like when communities come together and come from a place of not, it's your fault, and more of a, how can we get to an answer? We have more vibrant dialogue, and I think more comprehensive solutions. So I'm not up here to stand before you to say, this is what we need to do to get people back to work. Instead, I want to explore with you what's happened and what are some of the boundaries that are preventing people from being able to return to jobs. So let me dive into it with y'all. We started hearing about what economists are calling the Great Resignation back in April. The Bureau of Labor Statistics actually tracks what they call, and this is literally what they call it, the quits number. And the quits number hit 4 million people in April of 2021. 4 million people said, I'm leaving. I'm done with this position. And there was a great, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. And then that 4 million number was topped again in July with a little bit more than 4 million. And then that number was topped again in August with 4.3 million people leaving the workforce. And in April, of the people who left, 740,000 people worked in leisure and hospitality. In August, 7% of people who left were in accommodations and food services, which meant that 1 out of every 14 bartenders, waitresses, and hotel clerks decided to leave their job. And that's why when we are out in our communities, we are very much feeling this. We are seeing the help wanted signs in the restaurants we go to and in the cafes we go to, because they're very much feeling the brunt of that. And when all of this began to happen, people started saying, well, why is this happening? I mean, literally, Time magazine on Friday had an article that was titled, Why Everyone is So Rude Right Now, as a reason why people might be leaving. And they were talking about kind of the things, the whispering that you all may have heard of. The best way to capture some of what frontline people are experiencing is by looking at our airlines. So from August data back through 2021, there were 3,700 incidents of unruly passengers that led to 600 investigations. Investigations is that higher level of, it was bad enough, we need to take a deeper look at that. 600, y'all, just since August. So only 8 months worth of data. And let's compare that to 2019, when it was 146 investigations. So we're seeing this big jump. And people are saying, well, there's the whole political polarization that we're all experiencing. There's also the reality that the pandemic has had an impact on our mental health. And there's anxiety on both sides. Part of why people are leaving the workforce and part of why people are choosing not to come back to the workforce is that they're scared. The pandemic is killing people, and they are legitimately worried when a large portion of our countrymen don't want to wear a mask, and they are also scared of being vaccinated. And for me, this hits really close to home. There are people in my life who I love who are saying to me, I'm not getting vaccinated. People die from this vaccination. So we are feeling that anxiety from both sides. And some of that anxiety is displaying itself in very bad behavior. And that might seem like a really reasonable reason, that's terrible language. I wish I could be more eloquent. More reasonable thing to point to for people leaving the workforce and not coming into the workforce. But I'd rather take a deeper dive into a more holistic thing. So I'm going to throw a lot of stats out at you, and I will admit to you that on the way from Atlanta to Columbus, I was working really hard to memorize all of these stats. And when I walked in here and I saw the podium, I was like, oh, phew, I don't have to have them memorized. But they're interesting. So let's go back and I want you guys to be with me between the end of the 1970s and 2020. What happened to company productivity? Company productivity increased by 61.8%. That sounds like a great number. It is a great number. But unfortunately, that rising tide didn't lift all of the ships. Because do you know where salaries went? Salaries did go up, but by 17.5%. Productivity increased 3 times more than salaries increased. And that the money that we're saving between the increased efficiency and the not so increased salaries, well, that did go to salaries of our very top executives that we've seen blossom and blow up, and also to shareholders. And that kind of begins to niggle at what we're seeing around income inequality. And it's worth looking at over a very similar time period, what's happened to people who would be considered a middle income household. So middle America, who's middle class now? So between 1971 and 2019, we went from 61% of Americans having a middle income to 51%. It shrunk. Decade over decade over decade, we saw that shrink. Now, there's some good news and some very bad news with that information. So 6% of that 10% difference joined the upper income. 4% joined the lower income. But what I think is interesting is when we start to look at household wealth and when we start to look at middle class incomes, what they are. So between 1970, again, this is the part of the speech I'm giving you lots of data points, so play along. Between 1970 and 2018, the middle class income grew from $58,000 to $86,000. That seems like a reasonable increase. What blew my mind, though, was reading what the average upper class income was. It went from $126,000 in 1970 to $107,000. But what makes me even despair about this is when you look at lower incomes, that in 1970 were 20,000, and in 2018, it was 28,000, guys. 28,000. This is my last bit of data for you, and that's to talk about wealth. So the way we talk about wealth is in between the Great Recession and the start of the Great Recession in 2007 and then 2016, the median net worth of the richest 20% increased 13% to $1.2 million. In contrast, the net worth of families in those lower tiers experienced a loss of wealth by 39%. 39% loss, from $32,000 in 2007 to $19,500 in 2016. So I share all of this data with you because I think it's important to talk about as we talk about the Great Resignation. I believe what Americans are experiencing and seeing is a combination of factors. And that bad behavior that particularly frontline workers are experiencing is less of a driving factor and more of the straw that broke the camel's back. I think of that more as we have been working really hard and putting in lots of hours and seeing the Jeff Bezos and kind of the uber wealthy continue to grow. The fact that we have so many billionaires in the world right now is astounding. And not seeing that same kind of growth in our middle class. That there is an objection to, I am giving all that I can and not being treated with a level of integrity and worth and value that I believe I should be. And I like to talk about this in conjunction with, so that may be why people are leaving. And so then people will say to me, and y'all, I hear this a lot. When I'm out and talking about the problems of our unemployment system and how people waited 4 to 6 months on average to receive their unemployment benefits, I almost always get, well, why didn't they go get a job? Because we're all seeing help wanted signs everywhere. And that's why I feel like when we talk about I thought the newspaper might be up there. It feels like there's this disconnect between all of these people leaving and all of these people who say they can't find a job. That disconnect comes still back to that lack of wealth and resources. And I don't mean wealth in kind of a woo kind of way, a being able to live your life well. So let's talk about that for just a second. We have a minimum wage of $7.25. That's not Georgia's minimum wage. Georgia's minimum wage is $5.25. But because the federal is higher, people are paid the federal minimum wage. The federal minimum wage was set in 2009. 2009. Its value has decreased by 13%. It's even more striking when you compare the value of minimum wage back in 1965. Then the minimum wage buying power was 31% higher. So I want to have an honest conversation about why some people will choose not to take just any old job. I also want to talk about the impact that the pandemic has had on the things that we need. Since the start of the pandemic, Childcare costs are up 115%. 115%, y'all. It was, so I'm the proud mom of a son who is 15 and a daughter who is 13. And I remember cheering when I could send them to pre-K through the lottery program and not having to pay for childcare. It went from $6,500 a year on average to $14,000. That's your average childcare cost, $14,000. We are also seeing in the state of Georgia, rental costs are up 20%. I thought it was less than that. I used to say 10% because that was the most recent statistic I had. And I was looking, nope, it's up 20%. So let's say then that someone is like, okay, then I am going to take that job at McDonald's because McDonald's is now hiring at $15 an hour. $15 an hour is equal to $31,000 a year. All right, well, I also have a child. So I am going to put that child in daycare. That wipes out $14,000. So that gets me down to about 10, sorry. This is why I wrote out the math because I knew I wouldn't be able to do it off the cuff. Sorry. So you're left with 17. So you've got 31, you spend 14, you've got 17 left, okay? You live in Columbus. And so the average cost for a 2-bedroom in Columbus is $823 a month. That puts you just under $10,000. So you have about $7,000 left annually to spend. Do you know what that is, guys? That's $580 a month that you have left to pay for food, groceries, internet, hopefully. You're not going to be able to cover all of those costs. And I love going through this example because $15 an hour might sound like a lot to people until you actually start putting real numbers to it. So I think people are missing from the workforce because they are not being paid adequately. And they're not willing to come back for a low-paying job or a job where, on top of perhaps not being paid for what they are worth, they're also risking their life. Because in Georgia, I mean, I'm happy to say when I first started giving this speech, I was talking about our vaccination rate only being at 40%. Now we're at 51%. So that's good. But it's still scary, and you are very much still risking your life. I think that what we are experiencing is a moment in time where workers are starting to advocate for themselves. They're starting to demand more, and one of the few levers they have to pull is their feet and choosing where they want to participate in the job market. Now, I don't want to be overly simplistic about this. I can pretty easily say, when I talk about like Walmart and McDonald's, who are these big companies that are the moochers off of our government, moochers off of our tax dollars, because these are the companies that we pay the most food stamps to, even though they have people who are working full-time. I love that. I love that nobody gets up in arms about businesses being moochers off of our federal dollars, whatever. So we can all be like, it's easy to point to them and be like, pay your people more, pay them well. I think it's harder when we also talk about small businesses. And this is where I don't want us to get into an us versus them kind of dialogue of it's your fault and it's your fault. Because I don't think there's an easy solution. I was a small business owner. We employed people. We paid them well. We actually shared our profits with our employees. I had the luxury of doing that for the kind of work that I did. But a big part of why we're seeing the increased cost in childcare is that these childcare facilities are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to pay people well. And the minute they start to pay people well, the price tag goes up. There's the unintended consequences, Ron, that we were talking about before. So I do think that we need a more holistic dialogue. And instead of thinking simply about what are companies going to do or what do people have to do, I want us to think together as a community. So we should be having a dialogue around what is our common shared goal. And I think we should ask of a common shared goal for not just community members, for not just government, but also for businesses and business owners. Because there should be some expectation that the common shared goals for all of us is to strengthen our community. And that's, as a politician now, which is a new title for me, I've always believed that the purpose of government is to strengthen community. That should be the hat that government wears. How do I go in and strengthen community? So there are some ways that I think that we can do this individually. I think one way for workers is that's where unions have a role. And I know Georgia's not a union-friendly state. Out of the 50 states in the country, Georgia ranks 49th for union membership. But the reality is that there's a big differential between states with unions and states without them. It's about 3% in terms of the average income of employees in the states. And the power that unions have is they can advocate for workers in a thoughtful, cohesive way. And I think that there's a benefit to companies to have a thoughtful, cohesive voice as opposed to talking with individuals to meet that. Georgia's a right-to-work state, and that's something that we have to actually roll back. The biggest advocate, hold on, I should ask, how am I doing on time? All right, I'm nearing the end. The biggest advocate of right-to-work laws were in the 1940s. It was a strategy to keep Jim Crow laws in place. Vance Muse, this Texan, who was a well-heeled corporate lobbyist, a white supremacist, an anti-Semite, and a professional anti-unionist. He actually said the New Deal, I love this, was a communist Jewish conspiracy. And he went and wanted to put in place right to work so that it would kind of undermine unions. And this is how. You can choose not to join a union. You are under no obligations to join a union, according to federal law. But there are laws in place that the federal laws that that union members have to advocate for everyone in the company, whether you are a member or not. Right-to-work states put the additional burden of, if you don't have to be a union member, to also have the union advocate for personal singular issues. So, which tends to cost unions for their attorney fees thousands of dollars. The way unions work is through union membership. So right to work is one. The other is, I think that we need to talk about childcare as infrastructure, and we need to advocate that. And I think businesses need to advocate for that. I, as a business owner, would happily have had an option where the government was helping to pay for good, safe childcare for my employees' children. We need to talk about that. And I think businesses need to get into a place where they talk about what are expectations for not only the way they treat and pay their employees, but also what are the expectations that their customers should have for the way they treat their employees. So again, I think it's a holistic dialogue. I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think that we all need to be having this discussion as we are facing a point in time when when people are deciding what is going to make it worth it for me to engage with the rest of this larger community, and what am I willing to risk not to in this time. The more we know, the more powerful we are in trying to address these topics. So it was an honor to speak with you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thanks, Bill.